This video was brought to you by Brilliant. As anyone who lives here will know, the UK economy isn't in great shape at the moment. While inflation might have come down, growth is still stagnant, and real wages haven't grown in basically 15 years. But while a lot of attention has been paid to the UK's economic woes, less attention has been devoted to potential solutions. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what we see as the UK's two big economic issues, namely productivity and regional inequality, and then provide some tentative solutions on how we could fix them. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, in order to answer the question, how can you fix the UK economy, we first have to find out what's wrong with it. While there are obviously lots of particular things which are wrong with the UK economy, as we see it, there are two particularly acute structural problems: the UK's appallingly low productivity and the UK's stark regional inequality. Let's start with productivity. Productivity basically measures economic output per hour worked, and it's pretty much the most important metric in economics. That's because if your GDP is growing but your productivity isn't, then that just means that you've either got more people or you're working more hours. Nobel Prize winning economist Paul Krugman once even said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. Now, the UK's productivity has essentially stagnated since the 2008 financial crisis. Before the crisis, productivity growth averaged at 2%, but since the crisis, it's fallen to about 0.5%. To give you a sense of quite how bad and historically unprecedented this is, take a look at this graph. As you can see, for the 40 years leading up to 2008, productivity grows at a steady 2.3% annually, before essentially flattening. Productivity growth is now at its lowest in recorded history, lower than it even was during the two world wars and the interwar period. While other developed economies, including peer economies like Germany and France, have also seen their productivity growth slow since 2008, the UK has been particularly badly affected. From 2010 to 2019, the UK had the third lowest productivity growth in the G20, ahead of just Italy and Greece, which is astonishing given that from 2000 to 2007, the UK actually had one of the highest productivity growths in the G20. Analysis by the Resolution Foundation suggests that Brexit has actually exacerbated this issue too, pushing productivity down in all but a few unimportant sectors. This has contributed to both the UK's weak GDP growth and its appalling wage growth. For context, between 1970 and 2007, real wages, i.e. wages adjusted for inflation, grew by an average of 33% per decade. But they've been basically stagnant since 2008. After taxes have been accounted for, the median British household is now the poorest in the G7, and by quite some distance. On to the second reason though, regional inequality. As we've detailed in previous videos, the UK has some of the worst income inequality in the OECD. But what makes the UK's predicament so notable is its geography. If you take a look at a map of the UK by income, it's immediately obvious that the reason the UK has such terrible income inequality is because London and the surrounding areas in the southeast are way wealthier than the rest of the country, with London's GDP per capita being roughly 70% higher than that of the UK's second most productive city, Manchester. Lots of other countries are unequal too, but few have such a stark concentration of wealth in one area. In fact, if you took out London, then the UK as a whole would have a GDP per capita lower than the poorest region in not just the US, but also the Netherlands. Even including London, the median UK household now has a post-tax income well below basically every other G7 country. Brexit hasn't helped here either, by the way, because the EU used to send lots of money to the UK's poorest regions via so-called structural funds. After Brexit, the UK promised to match this EU spending with a new Shared Prosperity Fund, or SPF. But the SPF isn't actually as generous as the EU's structural funding, with about £80 million in real terms funding being cut. So, those are the two big problems for the UK economy: low productivity and stark regional inequality. But onto the big question. How do we fix these problems and thereby the UK economy? Well, let's start with productivity. One of the big things here is business investment. Essentially, British businesses don't invest in productivity-boosting stuff, like technology and training for workers. In the 40 years leading up to 2022, the total investment in the UK averaged at 19% of GDP, the lowest in the G7. And since 2008, investment in the UK as a percentage of GDP has been 3 points lower than the G7 average. So while many other Western countries also saw their investment levels fall during the 2010s, in places like Germany, France, and America, they've started rising again in the last few years. But this hasn't happened in Britain, where investment has essentially flatlined since Brexit. Fixing this isn't easy, but one of the big issues is that especially since Brexit, the UK has been beset by uncertainty, which has made it difficult for businesses to invest. Imagine you're a British farmer, for example, one of the least productive workers in the UK. You know that your current business model, which relies on outdated technology and cheap imported labour for stuff like fruit picking, isn't very productive. But you're not going to spend a whole load of money on new tractors and better technology when the government, and by extension its agricultural policy, changes every couple of months. There's always talk of new unbalanced trade deals with big agricultural producers like Australia, and the UK economy is constantly teetering on the brink of a recession. The point we're making here is that while some of the recent uncertainty is obviously a consequence of global events outside of the government's control, it's hard to deny that a more stable domestic politics would improve investment. There's also an argument that the UK should move towards a high-wage economy by doing stuff like raising the minimum wage and reducing access to cheap foreign labour, which was part of Boris Johnson's pitch in 2019. While this would probably wipe out certain low-paid jobs, it would force businesses to invest and ultimately raise overall productivity. Take our farmer again. Without access to cheap foreign labour to do the fruit picking, he'd be forced to invest in new automated processes, which would ultimately raise productivity. Higher wages could also help solve one of the UK's other productivity problems. UK workers don't move jobs or sectors as often as they should, which makes it harder for new productive sectors of the economy to grow. This is a consequence of the exorbitant cost of housing in the UK, which eats up wages and makes moving difficult. But higher wages would nonetheless help with this too. The final thing worth mentioning here is the UK's ill health. Essentially, the UK's population is less healthy than other peer economies, and more working-age people are reporting long-term health conditions than ever before, with the sharpest rise coming among younger workers reporting mental health issues. This ultimately reduces productivity and means that UK workers call in sick far more often than, say, French or German workers. The obvious answer here is to improve the NHS, either by reform or more spending, as well as getting Brits to eat a bit healthier. But this issue also interacts with the UK's regional inequality too. That's because people in poorer areas tend to have more health issues. So one of the most effective ways of reducing ill health would be to address the UK's regional inequality. Which leads us nicely onto the next part of this video, solving the UK's regional inequality problem. And unfortunately, international evidence suggests that this won't be easy. The best example of this is Germany. After reunification, East Germany was significantly poorer than West Germany, and the German government realized that they needed to level up the East. While Germany has been remarkably successful in this endeavour, most East German cities are now significantly wealthier than your average English city. It took 30 years, a massive devolution of tax and spending powers, and an estimated $2 trillion in regional spending in order to achieve this. To get a sense of quite how far the UK is away from this, consider that, as a percentage of GDP, German regional spending is 150% higher than the UK's, and Germany's development funds were over 6 times as generous as the UK's Levelling Up Fund. It's also worth saying that in the past 10 years or so, inequality within countries has started accelerating across the world. All in all, while the UK's economic problems aren't insurmountable, they won't be solved overnight, and probably require a degree of cross-party consensus. As we step into 2024, many of us are contemplating our New Year's resolutions, always looking to improve ourselves and learn more about the world around us. And while our content is always a good starting point, a lot of the stuff we talk about can seem pretty complicated, especially when we dive into analytics and detailed data. But luckily, there's a fun and easy way to learn more, which doesn't cost thousands of dollars or take years and years of schooling. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths, data science, and computer science interactively. And the good thing is that it doesn't take long to learn either. These complex topics are broken down into small but accessible chunks, designed around your busy schedule. Even just a few minutes a day can help you with accumulating new knowledge over time in a fun and engaging way. As time goes on, you'll get used to that empowering feeling of learning too, because Brilliant isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex topics, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. So, whether you want to brush up on your basic math skills, improve your employment prospects, or just have another New Year's resolution for 2024, you can check out everything that Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by going to brilliant.org/TLDR. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.